I'm currently located at the University of Manitoba, which is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Metis Nation. And we are deeply privileged to have a distinguished visitor today to tell us a lot about the nature of the homeland of the Metis people. I'm very shortly going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Brenda Gunn, to introduce our distinguished visitor for today. I just wish at the outset to note that during the presentation, if anyone has questions for Mr. Benoit, please drop them in the chat box directed to me, and I will let him know. He has indicated that he is not only open, but actually encourages questions during the presentation, as well as a question and answer period afterwards. So with that having been said, I will now turn it over to Professor Gunn.
Hello, everyone. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you all Al Benoit. We are so excited that he's able to join us today to give his lecture, Manitoba 150, The Unfinished Business of Reconciliation. And I just want to note before I introduce him further that this lecture came about as the Distinguished Visitor Committee was thinking about themes and ideas for the academic year 2020-2021. And it was apparent to us that the law school would be really remiss if we didn't think about having some sort of DV speaker related to Manitoba 150. And as we discussed the idea, we thought, you know, what voice do we want to hear and what stories do we want to think about in relation to Manitoba 150? And so we thought that the obvious place to turn to when thinking about Manitoba 150 was the Manitoba Métis Federation. And so we're really honored that Al has been able to join us. And I will note that when we originally scheduled the lecture, it was still in the year of the Manitoba 150, but due to the labor disputes last fall, we postponed the lecture until today. So I'm so happy that Al bared with us and was able to join us today. Al is the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the Manitoba Métis Federation President, David Chartrand, and Cabinet. He has nearly 25 years of experience in the areas of Métis claims, rights, and interests, including building Metis Nation government. His responsibilities comprise coordinating teams to respond to the changing legal and political environments, negotiating agreements, and developing policies. He's a citizen of Manitoba, or the Metis Nation Manitoba community here. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Al to begin his presentation. Thanks again, Al, for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to, before I start, welcome everybody here today. A special acknowledgement to any elders who may be on the video. I'd like to also thank Gerard and Brenda, as well as Christine and Lily, for the invitation to be here today. And as I do, because I'm very grateful, I want to recognize and thank President David Chartrand for the opportunities that he's provided, his guidance and leadership. He's been a role model for me. And it makes me feel younger as well when I say something like President Chartrand's my role model. No, he is. He makes our work possible, and he's taken the Manitoba Métis a large distance since 1996, when he was spokesperson for the Manitoba Métis Federation and became president the following year. So what I'd like to do, oh, I think I've lost, oh, there it is. For a moment, I thought I lost the ability to use the screen. So I'm going to do something different. Start out by saying I welcome you all to the birthplace of the Métis Nation, the heart of the Métis Nation homeland, and, this may be controversial, the treaty lands of the Red River Métis. Now, as we know, Red River is now Winnipeg, and I think it's appropriate that we understand that this is the history of the Métis Nation has its roots here in the city of Winnipeg. what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk about the Métis Nation. I like it when I have a captive audience because I can go and talk about who we are as a nation. What ends up happening quite often, and I've seen it at all levels, on the street, in academia, in the media, as well as when people who are lawyers and judges that are providing a speech or a lecture, they often say things like the Aboriginal people and the Métis, the Indigenous people and the Métis, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really important to talk about who we are, considering this is where the roots of the Métis started. We're going to talk about government. I think it's so important about reconciliation is that we talk about there being a government to government, nation-nation relationship. Unfortunately, in the province of Manitoba, we don't have that kind of relationship. We've been referred to by the present premier as an interest group, and he will not recognize who we really are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Manitoba Métis Federation itself. And I made that remark about welcome to the treaty territory of the Red River Métis. So I'll talk about what our people referred to as the treaty back in 1870, and we still do today. Then I can start to get into the 150 theme of the 143 years that we've been, that we were, until we got into the court. It's been a few years since, but it was the reconciliation. How are we renewing the partnership? The original partnership from the treaty in 1870. And then moving forward, what's our next steps? And then some concluding remarks. And it's going to take me a while to figure out exactly how this all works. See, I pushed my space bar, it didn't work that time. So there was a leader out of Saskatchewan, very, very important leader back in the 1940s and 50s and into the early 60s, a gentleman named Malcolm Norris. And Malcolm Norris once said, "To be ignored is more vicious perhaps than to be oppressed." And when you think about it, the Métis, although we have had our struggles legally, politically, militarily, with the Hudson Bay Company, with other Indigenous peoples, with Canada, with Britain, we've had all those types of struggles. But more often than not, we're just forgotten. And this is one of my favorite lithographs that I'm showing right now. And let me read it out to you. This is actually the title. A gentleman traveling in a dog carryall in Hudson's Bay with an Indian guide. Well, you start thinking about it. The dogs are there. I see them. You know, there's 3 dogs with all their color, and there's the Indian guide, the First Nations gentleman, in the front end, and then obviously the other gentleman is inside the sled. The guy who actually is running the sled, the guy who owns the dogs and the sled, is not even mentioned at all. There's nothing that says a gentleman traveling in a dog carryall with a Métis gentleman and with an Indian guide. It doesn't say any of that. So that is us not only being ignored, but when these records go into the Library and Archives Canada, they become forgotten. And we often refer to ourselves as the forgotten people. This is just one example, what I thought artistically shows the position that we're in. So who is the Métis Nation other than the forgotten people? Well, a shared culture. Everyone has heard about the buffalo hunters. There's the diorama that's at inside the museum on downtown off of Main Street. York boaters, the traders that had their cart runs all the way to St. Paul, Minnesota, and beyond. And then there's also the flower beadwork. And in fact, the Sioux and others referred to us as the flower beadwork people, because there's always names you pick up, nicknames, and that's how the Métis nickname was. Okay. We have a shared history, and the shared history includes the Battle of Seven Oaks. We call it the victory of the Frog Plain. And the Battle of Seven Oaks wasn't our name of the battle. It was a battle that we ended up being victorious. The Sayre trial, That's the trial that broke the back of the monopoly of the Hudson Bay Company. The Battle of the Grand Couteau, that's where afterwards we had a strong relationship, at least at a peaceful level, with the Sioux after that battle. The Red River Resistance, which many people will call a rebellion, which is not a rebellion. There was nobody to rebel against. And then the Battle of Batoche. Battle of Batoche being in north central Saskatchewan. Métis Nation shared leadership. And we were called by the Cree and others, the Otipemisiwak, which means the people who own themselves. We were independent and we were free. We had strong leaders that helped us stay free. And these are just some of them. Cuthbert Grant is the first one on your left. Go through to Louis Riel and Gabrielle Dumont. And then on the bottom, people like Elzéar Goulet and the Quran women, very strong women in front of their house there that's at Batoche. The man who's second from the left is a gentleman who has a lake named after him in eastern Manitoba. But when you drive by on the highway, they have a picture of a falcon flying. That's Pierre Falcon. He's a Métis poet and songwriter. And he wrote about the Battle of Seven Oaks, or the victory of the Frog Plain. And he's been lost in history. And in fact, a lake named after him is, people think it's a bird. So that shows you some, again, the theme of being forgotten. Shared struggles. In a very dark way, the Souvenir magazine on your left, the Métis are considered the snake, the serpent, and it's some land-based version of Britannia is destroying us. And then you have on the right, you have Louis Riel in his trial. You have the Québécois in Montreal that were supporting us and burning the effigy of John A. Macdonald. And then there's also the various battles that the Métis have had. So that's who we are. We have a shared history. People in Eastern Ontario or Quebec, they don't have that history. That history is ours. No one's ever coming out and saying they're not Indigenous. No one's saying they're not Aboriginal. Just saying they're not part of us because they don't share our history. And we're also Aboriginal. As one of the Métis peoples that are possible under the Supreme Court decisions, they've made decisions said there could be other Métis people other than the Métis Nation. So we are Aboriginal. We're Indigenous. This is in the MFV Canada, and it also in Daniels refers to us as Indigenous. And there's the Daniels decision where we're Indians. And of course, that's for 9124. But we're Aboriginal, we're Indigenous, and we're Indians. And that seems to be forgotten, that legally we span all three. But we have our own definition of who is Métis. And again, my remarks about people in the East who believe that they're part of the Métis Nation, the Métis Nation has come up with this definition. And I'll go through it quickly, a lot of words here. But a Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is of the historic Métis Nation ancestry, and is accepted by the Métis Nation through an acceptance process. Okay, well, sounds pretty straightforward. And then the historic Métis Nation are those people who were the Métis or the half-breeds, Métis being the French way of describing us, half-breeds being the English way, that were in the historic Métis Nation homeland. So the Métis Nation today are those people, those Aboriginal people, those Métis and those half-breeds that came from the historic Métis Nation homeland. And the historic Métis Nation homeland in 2002, as part of our national definition, was originally described as West Central North America. Now that right there became a challenge. Because what people were saying, West Central North America, well, that means Sault Ste. Marie is included in that. Some people argued that Toronto is part of that. Some people argued that West Central North America, well, it includes Ottawa as well. And which there's a place called Mattawa, which is really the focus of a lot of arguments right now, or disputes, is just north of Ottawa along the river, the Ottawa River. And people have said West Central North America goes that far east. So back in 2013, we cleaned that up.
Mr. Benoit, sorry,
Yes.
I don't mean to, we
Yeah,
have a
go ahead.
question here that I think
Oh,
is,
okay, sure. Should I go back
that-
one? Should I go back?
perhaps, yeah. This is from Cody, Wyoming,
Okay.
who asks, you will probably get this,
Mhm.
but what are your thoughts on what happened with the limited moose hunt that was allowed? There was a
Oh.
serious issue with the moose population
Yeah.
getting a mite that was also affecting deer. The duck and porcupine mountain areas were still hunted. The other indigenous nations refused the hunt, and so did the province. MFF have pushed it
Yeah.
through. How is that okay?
Yeah, you see, unfortunately, we get the media, and the media is, there's political people often do a lot of spinning on this.
Mhm.
So firstly, there is actually in the legislation that allows 60 moose to be harvested every year from that area. That is the legislation in that Manitoba government has. And they have been having permits where they've been, for Aboriginal people, they have been offering permits to people, and they've been using it. And also to Aboriginal communities. Now, no one knows who are the individuals and who are the communities, but it's being done. And I've seen the biological, the moose surveys, and the comments that I made there. Somehow what this has been happened is that even though there's 60 animals that both the law and the surveys have said, the science has said is harvestable per year, that is all of a sudden been forgotten. And then now it's become on the media as there being no moose available. Now, I mean, I don't have any answer on how that happens, but I'm just saying it is something that is a challenge, is when you go and you dig into the law, you dig into the biological surveys, and it's different than what you're hearing coming from spokespersons and in the media as well. So what we did is we said, okay, well, there's 60 animals, 60 bull moose available. What we'll do is we'll take 26 of those, and the First Nations can take what they want. We already know people are harvesting in this area, but we said, well, we'll follow the rules. We'll say, based on a percentage of our population, we'll take 26 of those animals. Now, what's happened is that the reports that I get from the outside is that the conservation officers knew people were there harvesting, met them, but never charged them. I suspect it's because if it goes to court, if it ever did, I don't think it will this time around. If it does, I believe that the courts will say, this is what the scientific evidence is. This is what the law says. There could be arguments about us making those decisions on our own, but that's my understanding of where it's at. I mean, because I was part of putting that program together with President Chartrand and with our natural resources staff. I hope I answered the question.
I suspect so, and I think you can please continue your presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Benoit.
Sure. So, it's funny. I have to use a different key every time I want to start moving forward, which is very strange. Okay, so in our definition, so what we did is in 2013, we made some clarity that West Central North America, it's not just a huge part of North America. We've narrowed it, and we said, well, the homeland geographically is the historic Northwest. And when we talk to our historians, they generally say that what was known as the historic Northwest was, you look at around Rainy Lake area, the area between Rainy Lake and Kenora. Fort Francis is Rainy Lake now, that area. And you look northwest. And in that direction, that's the Northwest. I mean, it's a part of all of Rupert's Land. And we also said, well, the historic Northwest is that part that entered into Confederation, not as necessarily as a province, it was the province of Manitoba, but entered as the territory into Canada, into Confederation in 1870 with the negotiations by Father Richot with the direction of President Riel at the time, as well as the Convention of 40, which was an assembly that was put together as a provisional basis for bringing the territory into confederation. So when we say West Central North America, we say it means the historic Northwest. So if you say the historic Northwest, then you've got to say, well, and that was accepted at the Metis National Council resolution, then how can there be questions about areas such as Mattawa? There can't even be questions about places such as Sault Ste. Marie, that it clearly means Northwestern Ontario moving towards into what's now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the territories. So I've talked a little bit about who the Métis are. I'm going to talk about a little bit about who the Manitoba Métis Federation is, about our democratic government. And we have a constitution. We had to operate, in order to do business with Canada and Manitoba, we had to operate as a corporate body, so under corporate law. So we have a constitution is actually made up of 3 sets of bylaws. One bylaw is bylaw number 1, which most corporations, or I think all corporations have, and it's the main body, but there's also an election bylaw, and there's a local bylaw for that part of our governance system, which is at the grassroots level. So there's, just to talk quickly about the Manitoba Métis Federation, we represent about 120,000 people. Currently, we have 38,000 new voting members, and we have we're broken into 7 regions, and each of those regions have 20 local associations, which are the grassroots village level executive. And we were created to be the democratic and self-governing representative body of the Manitoba Métis. And our objective is to provide reasonable, responsible and accountable governance. And that's how we operate. So we have our constitution, but we also have some decisions from the courts. And in their decisions, they talk about their evidence. And now, I'm no lawyer, but when a judge recognizes or accepts evidence, it has some weight. So in 2009, there was a Goodon decision. I don't know if all of you, I guess if you're on social media, you probably know Will Goodon. He's quite prominent in that virtual community. And what they said in the Goodon decision, this was over hunting a duck in the Turtle Mountain area. It accepted the evidence that the governing body of the Métis people of Manitoba is the Manitoba Métis Federation. And this is more recent, so we're jumping ahead almost 10 years. And I have this slide here for a couple of reasons. One is there's a 2018 MFV, the government of Manitoba, and others, and those others included the Minister Gertsen. Now, this particular case we lost. It was to get information about how decisions were being made by the Pallister government. What's important here, it was Justice Joyal who had this decision. What's important here is it said the MF is the democratically elected representative government of the Manitoba Métis. You know, hey, you take your wins when you can get them. I mean, if you're talking about government and you want that respect as a government, it's good that when the courts start to agree. And then there's the big one, is the 2013 MFV Canada. That's what we call our land claim. And the Supreme Court of Canada in 2013 said that this was a collective claim. It wasn't any individual claims about land that had been lost by somebody's ancestor. It wasn't a series or a collection of individual claims. It was a collective claim. And that the body representing this collective claim, or this collective interest, was the Manitoba Métis Federation, and we were granted standing. Before we got to the Supreme Court, we were twice told by the lower courts that because we were a corporation, that we couldn't have standing. But the evidence that went in was we were forced to be a corporation, to be under corporate law, because government wouldn't talk to us unless we did. And so that's what we did. And later they tried to use it against us in MFV Canada, and of of course, the courts saw through that ultimately in the Supreme Court and granted us standing. So we represent the collective interest of the Manitoba Métis. I believe it's time to start talking about treaty. Now, that's not my words. It's the words of the people at the time. So this is Louis Riel in his memoirs in 1885. And he made it clear that there were two societies who treated together. Treated. That's the past participle of the verb, meaning to treat, to come to a treaty. And why were we having a treaty? Well, it was explained that you had two societies. One was small, but it had rights. And the other was great, but the great didn't have any rights, no greater than the rights of the small. And Father Richot and the parishioners of Saint Norbert, they erected a chapel that is either echoes or at least it's similar in its concept to this saying by Louis Riel. There's a chapel in Saint Norbert, just south of where I'm talking. Well, actually, I am in Saint Norbert, but just south of where I am. And there's Mary, and she's holding the balances of justice. And you have the small ball is a heavy one. It's the one that's weighted down, its importance. And then you've got the large one representing Canada, which is up high. So the Métis at the time were able to get an agreement. You know, and again, I'll bring up a Supreme Court, you know, with their comments. So there were two nations, two societies coming together, the Metis Nation and Canada. And the Manitoba Métis were not considered wards of the crown at the time. And there's a whole PowerPoint presentation that someone can do on that comment itself. And they also said that the Métis were Canada's negotiating partners into the entry of Manitoba into Confederation. Now, knowing your history, you know, they were negotiating partners. We became partners. It became like a wedding, like a marriage, shotgun wedding of sorts, because everybody knew, if you know, that there was the military was coming. Well, and it did. But as negotiating partners with Canada, in some ways, and I'm throwing out there for discussion, is it goes beyond merely Section 9124. It goes beyond Section 35. It actually becomes part, the Métis become part of the compact of Canada, much like there used to be the two solitudes, Quebec and Ontario, coming together as the main forces in the creation of Canada. But oh, wait, we're over here. People have forgotten about us, the Métis. We're also partners in Confederation. So those were the conditions at the time. So this treaty, what is it? Well, it's sui generis. It's very unique. And it included language, religion, amnesty, and there were other things that never made it into the Manitoba Act. But what did make it into the Manitoba Act was Section 31. And Section 31 is is a grant of land. And the grant of land was 1.4 million acres of acres of land that was to benefit the families of the half-breed residents. It's described as being the land for the children. And that land for the children did not happen. The treaty in many of its respects was not granted. I mean, you look at it, there was the French languages was eventually dissolved from being used in, and Fauré and others had to take that to court. Religion, Catholic religion, schools and English Protestant schools are supposed to be equal and protected. Well, you don't have fully protected Catholic schools anymore, for instance. So Louis Riel in his memoirs, again in 1885, said, you know, the government didn't properly fulfill its obligations in its treaty with the Métis, and the government neither protected the Métis nor gave us justice. So the Manitoba Métis Federation took Section 31 to court. And Section 31 was about that 1.4 million acres of land. In my family, as in many families, people would always say, we lost our land, or they took our land. We never got our land, how we were cheated. And that was brought into the courts in 1980, I believe it was. And in 1980, we had to do the first step. Government Canada and Manitoba said, look, you're a corporation, you don't have standing. This is not justiciable because these people have been dead for, already for 75 years or longer. And that there's nothing here, just drive by, don't look, there's nothing here. There's been no criminal activity. Well, we had to go all the way to the Supreme Court the first time. And the Supreme Court said, yes, it's justiciable. It's one of those few times where they just walked out of the room and they came back 5 minutes later and said, yes, we send this back to the lower courts. Normally they have to, go away for 6 months to make a decision, but this time they did it almost directly from the bench. So we started all over again. And in 2013, we got a declaration from the Supreme Court of Canada. And President Chartrand rightly said, this is a new beginning. So what did the Supreme Court say in 2013? Well, they said exactly what our ancestors, our grandmothers and grandfathers had been telling us. The Crown failed to implement the land grant, that 1.4 million acres of land that was in Section 31. And that they talked about what Section 31 was supposed to be. Its purpose was reconciliation between the descendants of, the people of the Red River and the rest of Canada. And they said the goal of reconciliation and the constitutional harmony in Canada, unless you deal with Section 31, you deal with that 1.4 million acres of land, the reconciliation remains unachieved. And that this is a rift in the national fabric. And it's a matter, not just a matter to the Métis, it's a matter of national and constitutional importance. So when we got that declaration in 2013, and there was Bernie Valcourt was the Minister of Indian Northern Affairs at the time. And we met him. He was traveling across the country, meeting people in different cities. And we met him in the airport, in the hotel that was next to the airport in Winnipeg. And Bernie Valcourt, who was the minister, he said, I read the decision, tells me to do nothing. I'm not going to do anything. And of course, we kind of we didn't roll our eyes, because when you're staring and you're angry, rolling your eyes is difficult to do. So what we waited our turn. Well, not our turn. We waited patiently. We continued to speak with other elected representatives and talk with the bureaucracy and others, and preparing ourselves for this long struggle ahead. And Justin Trudeau, very open-minded. He's a good man. And what he did is he said a couple of times, once on a video that he gave in 2013, another, he talked about this in 2015 as a promise. He said, we'll have a negotiations process put in place right away to settle your outstanding land claim. And of course, they did. Now it's land claims and self-government, that's a long process. As they say, reconciliation is about renewing a partnership, but is not necessarily something that happens overnight. Reconciliation is a journey. It's not one event. Well, we did sign in 2016 a framework agreement. So that was only a year after the Liberal government got into place. And we had a commemorative ceremony and the signing on November 16th of the agreement. So what does the agreement do? Well, I mean, this presentation I'm talking about today is about reconciliation. It's about the 150 years it's been taking to get back to the renewing that partnership. If you were a songwriter, you'd say this is like getting back to the garden, getting back to the beginning. And this agreement was setting up a negotiation process for nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship that will advance reconciliation. And the two main areas are self-government and the actual land claim itself. So again, it's a journey. It's not one event. Now, First Nations that never signed treaty then get into comprehensive claims. they get into a process generally that may take 20 or more years and come up with one comprehensive agreement. Now, and then they do, because they kind of, it's such a huge agreement, they start to put in big implementation agreements as well in order to get the work done. And often when they're putting the implementation agreements together, there's nobody who can remember, why is it we did this back 20 years or earlier? Why did we do this? There's not a substantive record, just the actual comprehensive agreement. So the idea that's been now taking hold as we're advancing reconciliation is not to do the one big agreement, but do a number of agreements to get to the same state. And so there's two in this agreement, this 2016 framework agreement, we have interim measures and we have incremental agreements. Interim measures are those things that need to be done like right now. And then there's things that are called incremental agreements, which are more substantive. So for instance, we've been working on for some time now a self-government agreement. That will be an incremental agreement. We've started discussions on the land claim. That will be an incremental agreement. And these incremental agreements are done over time and they build on each other. And they can either lead to, or maybe in lieu of, a comprehensive final agreement, which is the way the First Nations have done it in the past. So, I mean, some analogies are, there's using it like a zipper, right? You're taking ideas and positions and interests and trying to bind them together as a zipper. The table is the zipper, the little thing that brings everything together. And over time, you get something that's all joined and solid. Another is a tree. This is a pretty sick looking tree, but the concept is get that core self-government and build from there the land claim, sector agreements on various things like education and health, et cetera, and start piecing together this tree, not necessarily, naturally from the roots up, but actually you do what you can at that moment in time based on needs and policies and where the law is at and what can be possible for that moment in time. So one of the things we did is one of those pieces, a branch on that tree, or one or two or three teeth of the zipper, well, we came up with a 3-part plan to advance reconciliation. And again, it's always about renewing the partnership, going back to the roots. And this was one agreement for 154 million, which was to invest in social and economic well-being. A good portion of that was considered a down payment on our land claim. I mean, whether that's the right way to describe it, I call it an interest payment, but different people have different ways to look at it. There's also we're working towards a self-government agreement, which we just talked about, and also finding ways to support the transition from a corporate structure to a self-governing Métis structure, which is the Section 35 legislatively recognized type of government, as opposed to being the corporate governance. This was from the 2019 budget, and the 2019 budget, I thought, had again clarified what we're doing here. We're doing a joint action, advancing reconciliation, committed to working together, and to reach a self-government agreement. That's what that piece was for, mentioned in the budget of 2019. This is about what reconciliation is about. It's about practical reconciliation. It's about renewing the partnership. It's about advancing, as opposed to what we're getting here in the province of Manitoba. In the province of Manitoba, it's about denial. Like, government of Manitoba cancels the tripartite self-government negotiations table. They stop funding it. They cancel the little bit of money that we had for health. They cancel a whole bunch of contracts and agreements. The big agreement being turning the page agreement, which is explicitly turning the page means putting the past behind you and moving forward in some sort of reconciliation. Canceled. I mean, so these are all the issues, and I brought these issues up tangentially earlier because I had said that there was that 2018 MFV, the government of Manitoba, and that they recognize the judge or the justice Joel recognized us as a government. But interesting enough, one of the arguments that we had put in there was the Path to Reconciliation Act. The Path to Reconciliation Act. He said that it's aspirational. It provides no guidance legally on how to deal with a particular issue we had at hand. So it's just interesting that you have, maybe this is relevant to the moose, right? You have an act that's supposed to say something, supposed to mean something, and then, you know, people shrug their shoulders, sort of like, you know, the minions in a Minions movie, they go, and move on, right? So that's what happened there. That's why I brought that up. So as we're moving forward, the main part is the partners in confederation, renewing that partnership. You know, like was that the treaty that we had back in 1870, that we believed we had in 1870. And that it wasn't only Louis Riel talking about a treaty, it was also John A. Macdonald in Parliament referred to the relationship or the activities that were happening back in 1870. He said, we're treating with the half-breeds. Again, that's seems pretty clear to me, right? Although it doesn't have like number 1 treaty, number 2 treaty, number 3 treaty, and it's not in the form or manner of what was considered a treaty. Again, it's unique. But as we're moving forward toward partners in confederation, I mean, I kind of look at this chart here as being the way to help organize the thoughts that we're moving in at least 3 streams moving forward, and they're interrelated. One is we go, and I mentioned just in passing, right, about how we're Indians under the Daniels decision. So I mean, that goes back to constitutional document of the British North America Act. And it's about the Métis being able to be treated equitably, getting the programs and services that have been denied them for so many years, because they've either been, well, not only denied, but they've been ignored. And there's still issues there today. There's, for First Nations Inuit Health Branch, well, I think the name gives it away, First Nations Inuit Health Branch. There's no Métis in there. It's like the thing about the dog carryall and the gentleman and Indian guide. Where's the Métis in that? So that's one of our movements forward. The other movement forward is the Pauli decision. And the Pauli decision is about rights. It's about Section 35. And as one of my elders once said, that hunting rights, which was what the Pauli was about, it's more than just hunting rights. It's about everything. And that goes back to the 1982 Canada Act. I mean, I know I'm talking to a bunch of lawyers here, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is for any policy wonks that are out there. And then there's 1870, which is the one we spent the most time on, the Section 31 Manitoba Act, but about the reconciliation, and the 2013 MF declaration, and that's about the self-government and the land claim as we move forward. Now, they're obviously, they do intermix, but in my mind, as I move forward, that's what I'm thinking about, is how that happens. Again, we're in a good place federally, not in such a good place provincially with the 2 governments, renewing our role as partners in confederation. On one, it is taking those steps for that nation-nation, government-to-government relationship, getting back to the treaty. On the other, it's denial, and in some cases, very aggressive denial. So I think that there's much more to talk about. I liked it that there was this question about harvesting or about moose hunting. I've got a whole PowerPoint on just moose hunting, how we've developed from the Pauli decision and the Goodon decision. We built our own management system, and we do have tags for our Métis harvesters. We've got identification cards. They have to do surveys. There's a management regime. So as we're moving forward, that helps to build institutions of self-government. And I leave this picture here as the Camp Red River Hunters, just to sort of get back to this idea that the Métis in these days would camp together, and from this hunt, the buffalo hunt and the camping and decision making is how we built the government that we have today at the Manitoba Métis Federation. So again, thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Benoit, for that fascinating presentation.